I seal the suite and breathe filtered air. Lights stutter, the gauge tips toward yellow, and walls begin to move. A white room becomes a cage. The thunderclap that split the Manhattan night sky seemed to shake the very foundations of the Meridian Tower. Though Ambrose Blackvein barely noticed from his sterile sanctuary 43 floors above the chaos of the city. His penthouse apartment was a monument to obsessive cleanliness. Every surface gleamed under harsh fluorescent lighting, every corner swept and sanitized with military precision. The white marble floors reflected the stark overhead lights like mirrors, creating an almost surgical atmosphere that Blackvein found deeply satisfying. Blackvein adjusted his silk tie and surveyed his domain with the cold satisfaction of a man who had bent the world to his will. At 68, he had amassed a fortune through ruthless business practices and an absolute refusal to show mercy to those beneath him. The economic downturn had been particularly profitable for him, as he'd foreclosed on dozens of properties and evicted countless families without a flicker of conscience. His leather-bound ledgers, arranged in perfect symmetry on his mahogany desk, documented each acquisition, each eviction, each life destroyed in his relentless pursuit of wealth. The apartment itself was a fortress against the contamination of the outside world. Every air vent was fitted with hospital-grade filters. The windows were sealed permanently shut, preventing any intrusion from the filthy city air. Temperature and humidity were controlled to exact specifications, creating an environment more sterile than most operating rooms. Blackvein had spent millions perfecting this sanctuary, and he took pride in its absolute cleanliness. The phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the antiseptic silence. Blackvein glanced at the caller ID and sneered. Another tenant, no doubt begging for an extension on their rent. He'd been receiving such calls all week, ever since he'd announced the rent increases that would drive out half the residents of his apartment complexes. The desperation in their voices always amused him, as if their pathetic circumstances were somehow his responsibility. Blackvein, he answered curtly, holding the receiver away from his ear to maintain distance from the contamination of human misery. Mr. Blackvein, this is Alara Vesrin, from Building 7 on Amsterdam Avenue. Please, sir, I'm begging you. My daughter needs her medication. And if you evict us tomorrow, I don't know where we'll go. The shelters are all full, and— Mrs. Vesrin, Blackvein interrupted, his voice dripping with disdain. Your sob story is neither my problem nor my concern. The eviction stands. Perhaps you should have considered your daughter's needs before falling behind on rent. But sir, my husband lost his job because of the factory closure. Your factory closure. You laid off 300 people, and now you're evicting us from our homes. Where's your humanity? Blackvein's thin lips curved into a cruel smile as he examined his manicured fingernails. The factory closure had been particularly satisfying. The property was worth more as luxury condominiums than as a workplace for the unwashed masses. Humanity is a luxury I can't afford, Mrs. Vesrin. Business is business. You have until noon tomorrow to vacate the premises, or I'll have the sheriff's department remove you forcibly. He hung up without waiting for a response, and immediately sanitized his hands with the antibacterial gel he kept on his desk. The woman's desperation had been palpable even through the phone, and he found such emotions distastefully contaminating. He made a note in his appointment book to increase security at the Amsterdam property. Desperate people sometimes did foolish things. Another rumble of thunder shook the building and the lights flickered momentarily. Blackvein frowned. Power outages were unacceptable disruptions to his carefully controlled environment. He made a mental note to call the building's electrical contractor in the morning and demand upgrades to the backup generator system. Perhaps he'd dock the maintenance fees from the commercial tenants' accounts to cover the expense. As he walked to his spotless kitchen to prepare his evening meal, a precisely measured portion of organic salmon and steamed vegetables weighed to the exact gram, something caught his eye. There, near the baseboard by the refrigerator, was a small, dark speck. It stood out like a blasphemous stain against the pristine white surfaces he maintained with obsessive care. Blackvein's blood ran cold. It couldn't be what he thought it was. Not in his immaculate sanctuary. Not after all the precautions he'd taken, all the money he'd spent on pest control, all the barriers he'd erected against the filthy outside world. He grabbed a magnifying glass from his desk drawer and knelt beside the refrigerator, his hands trembling slightly as he examined the speck. It moved. A cockroach. A filthy, disgusting cockroach in his perfect, sterile world. The sight triggered something primal in Blackvein, a revulsion so profound it made his skin crawl. He'd had a pathological fear of insects since childhood, when his alcoholic mother had locked him in the basement of their tenement building for hours at a time. The basement had been infested with roaches, and young Ambrose had spent countless terrifying hours listening to them skitter across the walls and floors in the darkness. It was those experiences that had driven his obsession with cleanliness, his need for absolute control over his environment. Blackvein's face contorted with revulsion and rage. He crushed the insect with a paper towel, then immediately disposed of the towel in his incinerator chute. He spent the next hour scrubbing the area with industrial-strength disinfectant, his mind racing with possibilities of how the vile creature had infiltrated his domain. He examined every seal, every barrier, searching for the breach in his defenses. The storm outside intensified, rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows with increasing violence. The building's old bones groaned and creaked under the assault, sounds that Blackvein had never noticed before, but now seemed amplified in his heightened state of agitation. The Meridian Tower had been built in the 1920s, and despite extensive renovations, it retained the character of its age, which meant cracks, settlements, and countless potential entry points for unwanted visitors. As he settled into his leather chair to review financial reports, specifically the projected profits from his latest round of evictions, another movement caught his peripheral vision. This time it was near the air conditioning vent, not one cockroach, 3 of them, scuttling along the pristine white wall like tiny harbingers of chaos. "Impossible," Blackvein muttered, grabbing a can of premium insecticide from his cleaning closet. The closet itself was a marvel of organization, filled with every conceivable cleaning product, all arranged in perfect rows according to function and toxicity level. He sprayed the area thoroughly, watching with grim satisfaction as the insects died. But even as he disposed of their corpses with surgical precision, doubt gnawed at him. How were they getting in? What had changed? The phone rang again. This time, it was Thaddeus Grimlaw, the superintendent of another one of Blackvein's properties, a man whose servile demeanor usually pleased Blackvein, but who now sounded uncharacteristically urgent. "Mr. Blackvein, we've got a situation here at the Riverside Complex. The basement's flooded from the storm, and we've got families with nowhere to go. Mrs. Morova's apartment is ankle-deep in water, and her baby—" "Fix it," Blackvein snapped, his patience worn thin by the evening's contamination. "And dock the repair costs from their security deposits. If they don't like the accommodations, they can find somewhere else to live." "But sir, with all due respect, these people have been good tenants for years. Mrs. Morova's been asking for months about the water damage in the basement, about the mold growing in the walls. Maybe we could relocate them temporarily, or—" "Mr. Grimlaw, you work for me, not for them. Handle it, or I'll find someone who will." Blackvein's voice carried the threat he'd used countless times before. Grimlaw, like all his employees, was replaceable. Blackvein slammed the phone down, his hands shaking with anger. The ingratitude of these people astounded him. He provided them with housing, albeit substandard housing he refused to properly maintain, and all they did was complain when things weren't perfect. They should be grateful for what they had, not constantly demanding improvements they couldn't afford. As he turned away from his desk, reaching for the sanitizer once more, he froze. There, emerging from a crack in the wall he'd never noticed before, a hairline fracture that seemed to have appeared from nowhere, was a steady stream of cockroaches. Not just a few, dozens of them, pouring into his sanctuary like a dark tide of vengeance. Blackvein grabbed the insecticide and began spraying frantically, but for every roach he killed, 2 more seemed to appear. They scattered across his white marble floors, their dark bodies a blasphemous stain on his perfect world. Some were large, their shells gleaming like armor. Others were small and quick, darting between his feet with nauseating unpredictability. "This isn't possible," he gasped, backing toward the center of the room. "I have this place fumigated monthly. I have seals on every possible entry point. I pay thousands for pest control." But the roaches kept coming, emerging from vents, from cracks in the walls, from spaces that shouldn't have existed. They moved with purpose, as if guided by some malevolent intelligence. Some seemed to watch him with their alien eyes, their antennae twitching as they assessed their sterile surroundings. The lights flickered again, and in the brief darkness, Blackvein could hear them. Thousands of tiny legs skittering across his floors, his furniture, his carefully curated possessions. The sound was like static, like rain, like whispers in a language he didn't want to understand. When the lights stabilized, he saw that they covered nearly every surface, their antennae twitching as they seemed to watch him. He stumbled toward his bedroom, hoping to find refuge in the one room he'd made even more secure than the rest, but stopped short at the doorway. His bed, his pristine white sheets, his sanitized surfaces, all were covered in a writhing carpet of insects. They seemed to pulse and move in rhythm, like a single living organism with a collective consciousness focused entirely on him. The phone rang once more. With trembling hands, Blackvein answered, hoping for some connection to the sane world beyond his nightmare. "Blackvein residence," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Mr. Blackvein, this is Lucian Duskborn from St. Mary's Hospital. I'm calling about the Morova family from your Riverside property. The baby didn't make it, sir. The flooding in their apartment caused an electrical fire, and they couldn't get out in time. The little one suffered severe smoke inhalation." The words hit Blackvein like physical blows. The Morova family, he remembered them now, remembered their repeated complaints about water damage, about electrical problems, about conditions he'd refused to address because the repairs would have cut into his profit margins. That's unfortunate, but I fail to see how this concerns me. Sir, the fire department's investigation shows that the building's fire safety systems were severely outdated. The exits were blocked by debris you refused to have removed, and the smoke detectors hadn't been serviced in years. Furthermore, the water damage you ignored had compromised the electrical system. This was preventable, Mr. Blackvein. That child's death was preventable. Blackvein tried to respond, but his voice caught in his throat. Around him, the cockroaches seemed to pulse with renewed energy, their dark bodies reflecting the overhead lights like malevolent eyes. They were climbing the walls now, covering the ceiling, creating a living canopy of horror above his head. Furthermore, Duskborn continued, his voice heavy with accusation. "Mrs. Morova wanted me to tell you something before she lost consciousness from the smoke inhalation. She said to tell you that the insects are coming for you. She said you'd understand. She said they've been waiting." The line went dead. Blackvein stared at the phone in his hand as the full horror of the situation crashed over him. Mrs. Morova, he remembered her now. A quiet woman who'd pleaded with him just last month to fix the ventilation system in her apartment. She'd mentioned problems with insects, with dampness, with conditions that were making her family sick. He'd dismissed her concerns, threatened eviction if she continued to complain. She'd looked at him with such sadness, such knowing resignation, as if she'd expected nothing better from him. The cockroaches were everywhere now, covering the walls, the ceiling, flowing across the floor in dark rivers. They climbed up his legs, and he could feel their tiny claws through his expensive suit. He tried to brush them away, but they clung to him with determination, as if they had every right to be there, more right than he did. "Get off me," he screamed, spinning in circles and slapping at his body. "Get off! This is my home, my sanctuary!" But they wouldn't be deterred. They crawled up his chest, across his neck, into his hair. He could feel them on his skin, under his clothes, their presence violating every carefully maintained boundary of his sterile world. Their legs were like tiny needles, pricking his skin with each step. He ran to the bathroom, hoping to wash them away, but the sink was clogged with writhing insects. The shower drain overflowed with them. Even his precious antibacterial soap dispensers were invaded, dark shapes moving beneath the clear plastic like swimming nightmares. In desperation, he fled to his safe room, a reinforced chamber he'd installed after 9/11, complete with its own air filtration system and communication equipment. The room had cost him $500,000 to construct, designed to protect him from terrorists, from chemical attacks, from any conceivable external threat. Surely this ultimate sanctuary would protect him from something as primitive as insects. But as he sealed the heavy door behind him, engaging the electronic locks and the air filtration system, he realized with growing horror that he wasn't alone. The cockroaches were already there, waiting for him in the darkness. They covered every surface of his final refuge, and in their mass he could see faces. Ilara Vezran pleading for her daughter's medication, Thaddeus Grimlaw begging for compassion, Mrs. Morova clutching her dying baby. The faces multiplied, showing him everyone he'd ever evicted, every family he'd destroyed, every life he'd ruined in his relentless pursuit of profit. They all stared at him with accusation in their eyes, their voices joining in a chorus of condemnation that rose above the sound of thousands of insects. He could hear their words, their pleas, their final curses, all the human voices he'd dismissed and ignored over the decades of his selfish existence. Blackvein fell to his knees in the center of the room, completely surrounded. The cockroaches climbed over him now without resistance, covering him like a living shroud. He tried to scream, but they filled his mouth, his throat, choking off his voice with their bitter taste and scratching legs. In his final moments, as consciousness faded and the insects claimed their dominion over his sterile world, Ambrose Blackvein finally understood the truth that had eluded him throughout his selfish life. In his obsession with cleanliness and control, in his ruthless exploitation of the desperate and the poor, he had become the very thing he despised most, a parasite, feeding off the misery of others, spreading contamination wherever he went. The cockroaches weren't the infestation. He was. When the building's security team found him 3 days later, after concerned and hopefully opportunistic tenants reported that he'd missed several important eviction hearings, Ambrose Blackvein's body was discovered in his safe room. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, though the investigators were puzzled by certain details they chose not to include in their report. There were no signs of insects in the apartment. Every surface was as pristine and sterile as Blackvein had always maintained it. The air filtration systems were functioning perfectly, the seals were intact, and not a single pest could be found anywhere in the penthouse. But scattered around his body were dozens of eviction notices, each one signed in his precise handwriting, each one representing a family he'd destroyed. And in the margins of every notice, in handwriting that didn't belong to Blackvein, was the same message repeated over and over in a dozen different hands: "They're creeping up on you." The Meridian Tower was sold within a month, the new owners promising to renovate the building and provide affordable housing for working families. Ilara Vezran's daughter got the medical treatment she needed. The families from the flooded Riverside complex found new, safe homes with landlords who understood that shelter was a human right, not a commodity to be exploited. But sometimes, late at night, residents of the building report seeing a figure in an expensive suit wandering the halls, brushing constantly at his clothes as if trying to remove something that isn't there. He never speaks, never acknowledges their presence, just continues his eternal journey through the building, forever pursued by the consequences of a life lived without compassion. The cockroaches, they say, finally found their way in, and they're never leaving. If you enjoyed this video, please do not forget to like, comment, or share this video with your friends. Subscribe to our channel to hear more stories like this one.